Today's World Insight, the facts and priorities in the global race for a coronavirus vaccine. A medical research team sets the record straight.
The first responsibility of a country is to protect its people.
Italy tries to pick up the pieces from a long lockdown, and it gets back on its feet with a new aid package.
And now there is the fear of re-emergence of cases if the reopening is not done well. We don't even have decided.
And hard lessons from South Korea on a new spike in coronavirus infection. Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. We begin today's show once again with the latest COVID-19 tally. So far, the virus has infected nearly 4 to 5 million people across the world and killed more than 300,000, according to Johns Hopkins University. The pandemic has cast a pall over the global economy. Many countries are cautiously emerging from a lockdown, but life is unlikely to return to normal until a vaccine is found. According to World Health Organization, more than 70 potential vaccines are in the pipeline. All of them are at various development stages. There are usually 3 stages, by the way, with a race against time to defeat the virus. A top EU medicines agency says in the best case scenario, a vaccine could be ready by early next year. So how far are we from a potent vaccine? With the World Health Assembly just around the corner, earlier I talked to Dr. Jeremy Kim, the Director General of the International Vaccine Institute, for more insights. Dr. Kim, a lot of new development regarding the vaccine candidates. Which ones are likely to be more helpful for all of us looking at the potential?
Vaccine testing in humans has 3 phases. Phase 1, primarily for safety. Phase 2, primarily to look to see whether the right protective responses are being generated. And then Phase 3, which is the real proof that the vaccine actually works and protects human beings and is safe. It's a little tricky because some of these vaccines are in Phase 1/2, so it's hard to tell exactly where they are. But basically, they're enrolling hundreds to 1,000 or so patients to try to see whether the vaccine is actually creating the right kind of protective responses. Right. And, in the end, if it's a group from China or a group from Canada or a group from, Korea that develops a vaccine, it'll be good for us, for mankind, for humankind. And I think that's the goal. Sometimes we get too engaged in the race, and we don't kind of see that in the end, we're doing this for humanity.
We hope everybody is looking at that goal and that goal alone. Having said that, though, there are difficulties ahead, particularly regarding the 3rd stage of trials that you just mentioned, which would involve many more people and on a much bigger scale. Dr. Kim, tell me more about that.
So the 3rd phase is actually the most kind of technically complicated and also the most expensive. Yeah. In that kind of trial, we take a certain number of people, and the number of people is actually chosen very carefully. If we know that there's a lot of COVID-19 infections going on in a country or in a city, we can actually choose a relatively smaller, we can do a relatively smaller trial. If we, for instance, think that the rate of infection has dropped off significantly, then we have to expand the trial. So in a trial that I did once, we involved 16,400 adults, and that's a fair number. If the number of infections is higher, then you can probably get away with 3,000, 4,000, or 5,000. But it really depends on how many infections you have in an area. Yeah. So for instance, right now, it would be difficult to test a vaccine in Phase 3 in Korea or in China because the number of infections is so small that you would have to have a trial that had tens of thousands, 100,000 people, and that wouldn't be efficient. Those kinds of trials take much longer to enroll, to get the volunteers together for, and it makes interpretation of information a little more complex.
Cooperation, therefore, become extremely important. Recently, we have being informed by the news that China and Canada, some of the private companies are working together about that. So what do you make of cooperation like this? How much is it likely to help with the original goal you just mentioned, Dr. Kim, to serve humanity?
As a vaccine developer, I mean, we work all over the world. This is a disease that occurs, in the wealthiest countries and in poor countries. 187 countries or more now around the world. So as we're thinking about this, we have to be designing trials that involve multiple organizations, that involve cooperation and collaboration. There's an organization called CEPI. Having all the experience, having the benefit of multiple partners will allow them to move a vaccine forward for humanity, for the world. I think that it would be an important gesture, a very important symbol, both of the fact that Chinese vaccines are advancing now and are among the most advanced in the world, but also because we all realize that this is an exercise. This phase 3 trial should involve people around the world and data that is going to be shared and shared openly as we know that the vaccine works and protects and is safe.
Let me ask you also about cooperation. Sanofi, which is a company, a global company, recently have been talking about its vaccine candidate, and it's very promising. And yet, the CEO recently revealed to the public, suggesting that the U.S. will have it first, as a result of a so-called a specific organization within the United States related to the government be providing funding for the research of the vaccine. Of course, French government is very upset about that, and later the board chair of Sanofi changed the original tune of the company's comments. So, but tell me more about that. So what does that mean? Whoever provides the funding, what rights and what limits should they consider? And when it comes to international cooperation and sharing of the vaccines and what you talk about as humanity, where should we look at?
So a very complicated and political question, but one that is really critical. So when we look at the groups that can fund vaccines around the world, the U.S. and China with their large scientific establishments and for research, are able to put significant quantities of money behind certain companies, whether it's Sanofi or whether it's Moderna or CureVac, which is an RNA company located in Germany. Countries will try to fund them, so U.S. or China, for instance, and as a consequence of that funding, the contract will often say, and for this funding, as a result of the funding that we're giving you, when and if there is a vaccine, then we have the right to a certain amount of it, and that's a part of the funding contract. That's frequently, it's done for flu vaccines, it's done for other kinds of vaccines, and so for the United States to do that is not unusual in the context of COVID, where we know that it's a global problem, that's causing hundreds of thousands of infections and deaths. It doesn't look right. For the Sanofi CEO to say that, he's a businessman. And China is funding its own companies to do this. Will the vaccine go, when and if we have a vaccine? The first 10 million doses will probably, and I don't want to put a country into a corner, but the country that pays for the research will probably want to have that vaccine first to protect its people. I mean, a country's interests are usually the protection of its people. How will it work in the end? We're not sure. Yeah. But I think that this is the time for countries to start talking to each other about how to prioritize the use of vaccine when and if an effective COVID-19 vaccine is available.
Recently, for example, Dr. Kim, we have seen finger pointing coming from the United States toward China about the so-called hacking related to vaccine development. Now, there are a lot of accusations the U.S. has about China recently, almost 3 or 4 every day being manufactured, and usually without much evidence, this time too. So So how should we understand? I'm not trying to put you into a geopolitical game because your job is not about that. Your job is a scientist. But how should we understand the ever complicated circumstances? This is just one of those examples that countries that are front runners are finger pointing at each other or at the other, trying to suggest that you are getting ahead because you're not doing well. But actually, realities could be a very different thing. Dr. Kim.
The first responsibility of a country is to protect its people. And when the outbreak was raging in China or when it was raging in Korea, the response of the government was first to protect the people. And you want that.
Yeah.
The second part of what the governments can do is that they can fund vaccine research or research in drugs that will help to treat people who are infected with COVID. That's the second response. All of the other things you should consider noise. The first responsibility is to protect the people, developing a vaccine, developing new drugs, using science for the benefit of people within China, within Korea, or people around the world is really the focus. We shouldn't get distracted. We should continue to work on vaccines and development. And we should think about how we're going to do this together rather than to think about who's going to get there first. We're doing this for a reason. So really, you remember, there are 3 phases to vaccine development: phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3.
Yeah.
And if we had 5 to 10 years to make this vaccine, which we don't, the last phase, during phase 3, a company is usually building new factories or gearing up to manufacture the vaccine in significant quantity, because once the phase 3 trial shows that the vaccine works and the regulatory agency approves the vaccine, the company wants to sell it in order to recoup some of the costs to make profit. We only have 12 to 18 months, which means that as we are talking now, organizations like the Gates Foundation and CEPI, some of the companies involved are looking for partners who can manufacture the vaccine when and if it's shown to be effective.
Right.
But we're going to need a network of these manufacturers probably distributed around the world because, in the end, 7 billion people will need to get this vaccine.
Yes.
And what if we need 2 doses of the vaccine? That's 14 billion doses. No one company is going to be able to make all of that. So we're going to have to think now about how we're going to make a vaccine available, how we're going to make the vaccine, and then how we're going to use the vaccine to vaccinate all 7 billion people in the world. So again, these are things, and the thinking has to start now. We don't have the luxury of 5 to 10 years to ponder and wonder what we're going to do when we have the vaccine. We know if this vaccine works and it is effective, there's going to be a huge demand for it. So let's start thinking about how we're going to make it and how we're going to use it equitably and give access to people around the world.
Dr. Kim beautifully said as a scientist, but some people are just trying to distract us every day with things that it is not relevant to saving lives. In your chair, what can you do? And how do you talk to your peers, your colleagues, your friends, and your fellow scientists about all of this?
So, the scientific community, I think, is pretty clearly behind the idea that we focus on the work. We understand the virus. We understand how it hurts people, because that is all going to help us understand how to make better medicines, how to make monoclonal antibodies that will shorten the duration of infection or keep people from going on ventilators.
Indeed.
That is a focus. We focus on the vaccine because we know we only have 12 to 18 months, because for every extra month we take, there are additional infections and deaths. So we're able to focus, and we focus on the science and the data. The distractions are troubling. But again, countries need to focus the same way scientists do. They need to protect their people. They need to put into place effective programs that limit the spread of the infection, that keep people out of the hospital, that preserve the lives of their citizens. That is what a country does. And so everyone needs to focus. Countries on what they're supposed to do, and scientists and vaccine developers like me on what we're supposed to do.
You're watching World Insight, still to come on our program. Italy tried to pick up the pieces from a long lockdown. Can it get back on its feet with a new aid package? Some answers right after the break. Welcome back. This is World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Italy is now emerging tentatively from one of Europe's longest and toughest coronavirus lockdowns. Italian Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte on Wednesday presented a new aid package worth about 55 billion euros to cushion the economic impact of the coronavirus pandemic. But how long before the country is getting back on its feet? And what are the challenges ahead? Earlier, I talked to economist Miguel Galacci, the former Undersecretary of State at the Italian Ministry of Economic Development. Let's listen in to his views. I know you are in Rome. How is your country dealing with it, the latest situation, both the pandemic and the jobs?
It's a tough situation. We have made the typical mistake of underestimating the health risk, and so we have been acting late, chasing the problem rather than anticipating. And what could have been maybe a lockdown in early February and March done well, and then maybe restart now, is actually now dragging on, and we are now in the middle May with still a partial lockdown and no clear plan to exit. So unfortunately, we are in a both health and even worse now economic situation that needs serious attention.
55 billion, that is the number likely to come out in terms of aid package the government provides. I know there's still a process to go in terms of making it to work through governmental procedures. Professor Galacci, how much is it likely to help, though?
I think this is an initial step, but it's too little, too late. There are many problems. The 55 billion euros is not enough. We need 200 billion euros. Then we also have many political parties involved on deciding where is this 55 going to be spent. And very likely will be broken down into small pieces to make everyone happy. And therefore, when things are distributed, they don't really have the effect that is required. I'll give you an example. Tourism in Italy is only direct value is 100 billion euros. If we look at related industry, it's about 240, roughly 13–14% of the GDP just for tourism. So this is gone. This is like -70, -80% for the year. So probably we lose 100 billion only from tourism. And the package is 55 billion divided into many sectors. So we need really a stronger and quicker, because even this 55 is not going to be ready tomorrow. It will take weeks and months. And in the meantime, we lose jobs, company close down, and many of them will never restart again.
More and faster, but where does the money come from? 200 billion. Let's just say the price tag, you put it out there. Where will that come from?
This money comes from new bond issues, which is perfectly okay because Italy has good access to the financial market directly without even needing to recur to the European Union assistance, which is also coming late and little and with many conditions. So we have always argued, and I personally argue, that Italy should just finance its own expenditure with its own deficit. Of course, debt to GDP will go to 160%, 160 this year, and probably 170 the one after. So we are getting into very high situation, but c'est la vie. This is the situation. It's quicker and more effective to issue bonds directly as Italian government bonds rather than European bonds.
So now we will have to wait and see how things would evolve, right? About that 55 billion euro and whether they are likely to work.
We have to wait and see, but unfortunately, and this is what I'm trying to, the battle that I'm trying to fight every day is to try to persuade Mr. Gualtieri and other members in the government, Mr. Conte, to really act soon, because wait and see is not a luxury that we have now. We did, remember, on January 31st, we declared health emergency in the whole country for 6 months. And we still, after 4 months, we don't even have the masks. We don't even know where we should wear them or not. So we have really wasted time despite the announcement, despite being in health emergency, which has never happened in Italy in the last several decades. Words have not been followed by actions. And now we are stuck in the middle. companies want to reopen, of course, because the economic situation is in danger, but the health situation is not being solved yet.
Yeah.
And now there is the fear of re-emergence of cases if the reopening is not done well. You know, we don't even have decided whether we should use the contact tracing app.
Right.
Again, after 4 months of discussion, we don't even know if it's okay, if it's a privacy issue, if we should look at China, Korea, Israel model. So really, we are in a situation of fluid, let's call it.
Okay. Two necessities. One is masks, the other is tests. Usually when we do not have 100% certainty about how situations are, these are crucial tools for economies to realize whether it's the right moment to open up and to what degree. Beautifully said, Professor Garaci. Having said that, though, what about Italy's interaction with the EU? Now, there have been earlier self-confessed by the EU leaders regarding whether they have been providing sufficient support to the member countries, and they apologize for that to a certain degree. But what about the situation now from an economist perspective?
I tell you, leaving aside the politics, from an economic perspective, the EU has no money, has no real budget. It's only very, few billion. That is not what we need. So what the only thing the EU can do is to get itself in the middle between countries and the financial market and try to maybe issue bonds at a better yield than countries would do individually. But the European Union itself does not have money to give it to people. The only thing that can be done at the EU level is the European Central Bank. They have the money, they can print it, and they can purchase the bonds that each member state issue, and therefore helping the cost and yield of those bonds. But I'm really very skeptical about any EU rescue plan, because we have internal divisions. The 19 members of the Eurozone have different goals, different stages of pandemic, different stages of economic crisis. There is really no solidarity between EU members, because let's not remember, we are 27 countries, different languages. We are not one country, and therefore I'm very skeptical about this help. I've even told members in the Italian government, do not really waste time to go to Brussels anymore. Let's just do the things our own here and ourselves in a more effective and quicker way.
Professor Garaci, as an economist, let me ask you about that regarding the economy in the EU as a whole. Now, we see different economies really are at very different stages of this pandemic. So how would this entity work, and how would each other provide both market and products for one another? That is probably one thing needs to be urgently figured out. Professor.
You're right, and I believe, again, you said I'm very straightforward. China will be the relative winner. We had the minus 6.8% GDP, 1 quarter. Many Western media have made a big fuss of it because it's the first time in 40 years. So what? China will have an investment plan and will do what is needed to restart the economy. And the same for Korea and other Asian countries. Similarly, the United Kingdom, perhaps the United States, the main problem is within the core of the Central and Southern European, because, when we have different stages of restarting, of reopening, and borders open, we will have returnees and, imported contagion situation. So either we limit or monitor the borders, or otherwise the flow of people that we have seen recently will not happen as it used to be. Now, this is not necessarily bad news per se, because goods can continue to travel without people traveling. But more positively, I think we will see development of the software and digital industry. That is easy to transfer between one country and the other one. It does not require physical shipment, and definitely does not require people's movement. So I see a world where we have some countries winning, China, Korea, the United Kingdom, some countries lagging behind like Southern Europe, and travel industry will have serious problems, of course, but digital will develop. And this is where I think we in Italy and the countries that suffer economic losses, we should concentrate to develop and put some of the money on the development of this industry. But none of this 55 billion or very little is aimed at that, because it's mostly aimed at rescuing existing industries rather than developing the new one. And this is yet another problem the country faces. They need to focus on mitigating the effect or be forward-looking and try to invest into new sectors. Otherwise, we will have the problem in 2-3 years' time.
Yeah. But on the other hand, you know, you think about the new technologies, wonderful growth potential as you illustrated. However, on the other hand, we do not want to forget there's also the issue, the backdrop of not just pandemic, but geopolitics, which existed before the pandemic. And 5G becomes such a sensitive word, and yet it should be a word that should be celebrated by the world. So, Professor Geraci, you know this. You work in the ministry. You know how geopolitics comes into policies too. So how does that work, do you think, at this moment?
So I am positive about this. I think once November comes with the United States election behind, I think the attitude between the US and China will tone down a little bit, and we will not reach the very healthy and nice relationship from many years ago, because now we have raised the bar. There will be a new normal also for China-EU relationship, but at a lower and more stable level than we see now, which is a little bit erratic. And I'm positive. As you mentioned, I work on trade, and I see the attitude of Mr. Lighthizer and Vice Premier Liu He. I think they are working, as technical people behind and in a more effective way than maybe President Trump would like to show. So I'm positive this tension will go down. Now, technology is an issue, but it doesn't have to be just the 5G. For example, I used to teach in university. Online learning, remote diagnosis for medicine can actually reach parts of the world who are in Asia and in Africa and even in Latin America and even in Europe that otherwise would have not been reached. So technology is not just bad because of spying and whatever can be done with 5G, but it needs to be put at the use of the common people, like we did for the internet, like we're doing for learning, I said medicine and many other sectors. And I think this is a good way to diffuse the tensions. So I know every time we say 5G, people get excited. That's why I don't even mention it anymore. I just talk about what we do with it without saying how. People don't care if it's 3, 4, or 5G. They need to know what is it that we do with it. And I think if we focus on the benefits, people will relax a little bit.
Yep. My final question, Professor Geraci, I know you're an economist, you work in the Ministry of Trade, but I still want to ask you about this, that what about this cross-Atlantic relations? Now we see during the time of pandemic, countries have to focus on their own priorities. Of course, they also need to focus together of the common interests, for example, vaccines, saving lives, things like that. So at this critical moment, what are some of the sensors you have regarding Europe as a whole, or some of the economies on the European continent? How do they look at their relationship across the Atlantic and also their own blueprint for the future?
The relationship, despite the perceived unity of the European Union, the problem is that the European Union has really no legal standing to do foreign policy. So despite you see trade, of course is done at EU level, but foreign policy is not. And so foreign policy falls back into the responsibilities of individual member states. And therefore, everyone does what they think is right. The UK may have a special relationship, so with Germany, so with Italy. We do all have a good relation with the United States, but then the terms of engagement are very different. I've been dealing a lot with the relation between Italy and China. I did, of course, look at the relation between Brussels and China, but clearly the most effective way to deal, negotiate, and establish relationship is a bilateral, not at the regional level. Because Chinese policymakers and government, if I may, yes, they do look at Brussels when it comes to trade, tariffs, but when it comes to the foreign relationship, foreign policy relationship, personal relationship, they do go to individual countries, as they should. So I will see a fragmentation within Europe of the relationship with the United States, some stronger, some weaker, but that's a different thing from doing the interest of our own economies, which is the duty of every government.
Yes, indeed. Miguel Garacci, the former Undersecretary of the Italian Ministry of Economic Development. Always a pleasure, Professor Garacci. Be well and be safe, please. You're watching World Insight, still to come on the program. Hard lessons from South Korea on a new spike in coronavirus infections. Welcome back. This is World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. After weeks of nearly no new locally transmitted cases, a new spike in infections rocked South Korea, mostly centered around nightclubs in the capital city, Seoul. And the country has been working very hard to stem a second wave. There are crucial questions, though, regarding fighting the pandemic in the next stage. How can we strike a balance, saving jobs and saving lives? For a closer look at these, I talked to Dr. Alice Hin Kyung-tan, an internist at Ms. Medi Women's Hospital and a frontline doctor from South Korea. Another thing I want to ask you really is about the tests that you're still doing about any people who are related to this cluster of outbreak. Now, how are you working with the other countries? After all, there was some kinds of travel ban, but still people are traveling at the time when the incident broke out. So particularly in the neighborhood country, China, Japan, for example, how is that being done, the communication part at least?
So anytime there is a imported case or a travel-related case, I think it's our Ministry of Foreign Affairs that makes sure that the information is passed on to the country from which the traveler arrived. However, there are certain regions such as Europe or the United States where they're not doing the extensive testing that we are. They're not doing the extensive tracking and tracing. And so even if we give them this information, it's very difficult for them to trace and then test the contacts. It's more done on an individual basis. And I've heard cases actually of, for example, I know of a young gentleman who came from the UK. He tested positive. He was in quarantine. He contacted all of his roommates and friends, and they had a very hard time getting tested, even though they were close contacts. And so the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is working on this, and we are trying to inform not just our neighboring countries, but we're seeing an increase of cases from actually Africa, Tanzania, from the Middle East, especially Kuwait. And so we're working on trying to get some degree of cooperation, obviously, between our countries so that the information regarding positive cases is given very freely.
How would you compare PCR tests and also antibody tests from your perspective?
So they both have certain roles to play. The antibody test lets you know if you had COVID-19 sometime in the past, but it doesn't tell you when. The PCR antigen test lets you know if you had a recent infection or you're currently infected, say if you've never had a history of COVID-19 before. If you do a combination of the two, it can give some information in terms of where on the clinical course, say, for example, an asymptomatic patient, where in the clinical course this patient is, because antibodies are formed later on in the infection, whereas, of course, antigens are produced very early on. And so I think each test has its own role. Antibody testing can be used, as I said, in communities, in populations, just to see how many asymptomatic patients were there in the past, or, you know, maybe people had slight symptoms but didn't suspect COVID-19, didn't get tested for COVID-19. But if we check for antibodies, then we can know, oh, maybe there was a 2% prevalence or maybe a higher prevalence of COVID-19 that we just didn't know about. So they both have important roles going forward.
There are countries around the world, even some very developed economies, that have been promising to have tests as much as possible, but still will not be able to implement that. With those cases in mind, Dr. Tan, do you have any advice for them?
Fast, accurate, widespread testing is an essential pillar to managing COVID-19. Countries that have very robust public health systems in place, I think, do better. Countries that are making the test either free or very low cost are doing better. Countries that can produce the test kits domestically are also doing better. And countries that recognize the importance of testing, I mean, some countries are denying it, but countries that recognize the importance of testing are also doing better. And then going on to the next phase, because many countries are still, when you start to open your economy, you need that capability to test potential cases to know where the disease is going. Is it trending upwards? Is it trending downwards? Without testing capacity, there's no way of knowing.
Dr. Tan, there are a lot of unknowns about this virus still today. There are a lot of things that we don't know as to what this virus eventually would cause and what might be the mutation of the virus, and as a result of that, what does it mean for individuals, for the societies? So Dr. Tan, will testing be able to help us, at least in the most basic way, some of the most important points that we don't want to miss?
There can be mutations. We're checking for mutations at least once a week to see, if the PCR test, to say if there's a significant mutation that's going to make the PCR test invalid, we want to know about it. Up until now, that's not been the case.
How you've been trying to link the mutation with the PCR test accuracy? I think this is a fascinating thing that we want to hear about.
So there are certain fragments of the virus, of the virus's genome, that the PCR test is checking for. And if within that specific fragment there has been a significant mutation such that the PCR test can no longer pick up the virus, then it would make that test moot. But that has not been the case. Now, going forward, we're all in the stages of developing a vaccine. Mutation of the virus is going to be important in terms of vaccine development as well. And of course, this is what happens every year with influenza. We get mutations, and that's why we need a yearly new influenza virus. We don't know if that's going to be the case for COVID-19. We hope that the viruses that are in development now, the vaccines that are in development now will match the viruses that are the COVID-19 virus that's in circulation. So yes, there are a lot of things that we still don't know about the virus. One concerning aspect is a hypersensitivity, a hyperimmune. We had been thinking up until now that COVID-19 is fairly benign in the pediatric population. But now that these cases have been reported in the US, in the UK, in Europe, this is quite alarming. And Korean schools have not opened yet. They were supposed to open today, but because of the new cluster from Itaewon, the opening of schools has been delayed by a week. But a lot of people are worried. We don't know the full spectrum of the behavior of COVID-19 in the pediatric population.
And that will do it for this edition of World Insight. To find out more, you can always search our program, World Insight, and check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.